We've all heard the term death by PowerPoint, but sometimes when you got a lot of data to tell, death by PowerPoint becomes the default stance. But it doesn't have to be. And that's what we're talking about today with JD Schramm. He is a speaker, he's an author, he's an educator at places like Stanford, USC, NYU, and Columbia. And he's here to share his wisdom on how we can make our data story sing. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a four-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. JD Schramm, I'm so excited to have you here today. And I've seen so many of your videos, but you're like actually here in real life in the moment. So thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Absolutely, Karen. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations on your new podcast. I've listened to several of the episodes and I feel fortunate to be in the lineup of topics and folks that you've brought in to chat about them.
Well, thank you. I know that we have some common friends, and that's one of the joys of this to be able to talk to them for a longer length of time and learn from them because as somebody who is constantly teaching others, I love to learn too. So it's been a real joy. But I want to begin this conversation about the value of telling a story to make your statistics come to life. But first, I want to begin by, speaking to your philosophy that you have, and I'm going to quote you back to you, which is you say, I believe each of us has the power to speak and write in a way that inspires others to act. Now, there are likely listeners in our audience who believe that is certainly not the case because inspirational speakers are just born that way. Why do you feel that's not true?
I feel it's not true because one of the most persuasive elements is authenticity. And if a leader can authentically represent her passion or his proposal or their vision, their ideas, that oftentimes can be as effective or more effective than polished presentation skills. And that's why I believe it is something that's available to everyone. And it is something that without spending time on a podcast like yours or spending time in a book like mine, things can block us and get in the way that don't allow us to communicate with the greatest strength that we can.
I always talk about the inner critic being our biggest villain in our communication. And yeah, that you're definitely speaking to that. Authenticity is something I believe all speakers need to be steeped in order to be at their maximum impact. So we are of like mind for sure on that, JD. So let's like dive in. We both work with leaders who oftentimes are given the daunting challenge of presenting data in an impactful way. Where do you feel that most leaders fall short of that goal?
Two areas to answer that question, and one I think is on them, and one I think is on their team around them. I think what gets in the way of many leaders in their own mind is they're so focused on the message they want to deliver that they don't slow down to think about what's the message this group needs to hear. And it's that strategic focus before you walk into a meeting, before you start an all hands call, that what is it I want to cause in this conversation. So I think that's on the leaders. And I picked up on this on one of your podcast interviews, on the team. I think they throw too much at the leader right before they communicate. It's like, oh, hey, while you're up there, can you make this announcement? Or, oh, we changed, we're going to do it in third quarter instead of fourth quarter. Like, that's just, as you said, that's unfair to a leader. So I think it's both what the leader does, but it's also what the people around them do.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt that, I think, in the episode I talked about when I was like, wait, I did all this preparation. Now you're completely changing what you want me to do. And it's very difficult to manage that. But absolutely having the opportunity to put yourself as a leader in the shoes of those who are receiving your message is critical to be able to hit the right note. But let's dig into that a little bit further, because you suggest that storytelling is the key to making data come to life. This might seem counterintuitive for those who are number oriented professionals and they think that their data is just going to dazzle on its own. I'm sure you've seen this many times in your career. So, why do you feel that story is so valuable?
Well, it's story with strong data. So I want to honor the folks who are listening to this today in your audience, that I'm not saying don't do the analysis, don't understand the data and run the regression that you need to and look at it, 12 ways to Sunday. But once you understand the data, then you have to take that data and make it understandable to the rest of us in a very short amount of time. And that's where the storytelling adds huge value. If someone tries to create, and I've made this mistake as an activity in class one time, if somebody tries to create a story without having the time to understand the data, it's silly, or at best it's superficial. So you first have to understand the data, and then you have to figure out a narrative that lets other people understand it.
Right. It almost requires a higher level of thinking to be able to put it in story form, because anybody can like regurgitate facts, regurgitate numbers, but being able to connect the dots and share the story, the vision behind that, what's valuable, requires you to have a better grasp of what is those numbers are really saying.
Absolutely. And I think being able to help leaders move from the data dump to the data narrative, uh, they and you also have to let go a little bit of the pride of the data analysis that you did, because we want you to do all that analysis. We don't necessarily want you to tell us all of that analysis. We want to know the implications. And so that often is, it's not disrespectful to the data, but it limits how much they can talk about the way they got to the numbers that they're sharing today.
Right. And if somebody asks you a question, you say that you're flying at 35,000 feet, and then somebody asks you one that's like at, 5,000 feet, you need to be able to retrieve that information for
Yep.
that, deep dive, but you don't need to tell them all of it, at once, because, oftentimes they don't, there are certain folks in the room who won't care about the nitty gritty detail of that on that certain area. So yeah, being able to uh, call upon it when needed is
Exactly.
essential, but you don't have to do it all at once. So, in your keynote, which I highly recommend everybody check out, you have a sliver of it on your website. You focus on this topic: successful storytelling through statistics, which I like from an alliteration standpoint. You also share some great examples of PowerPoint gone wrong, and everybody, laughs whenever they see it up on the screen. But here's the thing: probably a lot of the people who are laughing also do the same thing. They're violating the same rules. It's so common for people just to do, the proverbial death by PowerPoint. What do you think is the most common violation that you see whenever people are putting together visual, I'm going to say leaders, or leaders who are having their slides made for them? What's the biggest violation that they make when it comes to visual aids? And I'm going to put aids in quotation marks because oftentimes they're not aids.
Like that. I may quote you on that
Go
one.
for it.
Uh, oh, I thought you were going to bring a visual aid today. You didn't.
Exactly.
Um, so I feel bad. Every question you've asked me, I said, well, I have two answers, but I
That's all
think there
right.
really are two problems that happen. And the first thing that came to mind is unnecessary complexity. And there are schools of thought that look at the amount of real estate on a slide and how much can I put there. And they'll put a legend and they'll put a footnote and they'll draw extra arrows, and then maybe they'll have two or three bullets, but they really need to be short sentences. And all of a sudden there is so much competing for our eyes, we don't know where to look. And so unnecessary complexity is the first one. And with that, you can sometimes get away with complexity if you layer it in for the audience. If you give them a blank landscape and say, so we're going to look at, X versus Y. We're going to look at cost over, the last 5 years. And then you drop in the costs, and then you drop in the trend line, and then you show the second x-axis and what that means. But you've got to not spoon feed us, but you've got to walk us through the story fairly quickly. Wherever I can eliminate a legend, a footnote, a citation, a company logo, like anything I can get off the slide, that lets the data story live. There's a great quote that's attributed to Coco Chanel that she says, when you get ready to go out for the day, you get yourself dressed, you look in the mirror, and you remove one accessory. Easier for you than for me, but you take off a scarf, or you lose the brooch, something that allows what you chose to be at its essence and more compelling. Same thing with a PowerPoint slide. What can I remove? What can I lift off so that what remains has more impact?
You're talking about, in the second part, you're talking about like the builds and the animations. And I have so many leaders who fight that because I don't know, it like stresses them out to think about like clicking through stuff. But I always like to show, okay, this is how you would present it. But if I were to do this, allow me to layer this and walk you through it. And then there's kind of that aha moment. But you'll also have the leaders who are like, but I've got a laser pointer and I can just use that to show where I'm like, no, the laser pointer makes me think of like whenever you're playing with a cat and you want them to follow like the red dot, you're like, no, that is so distracting. So I totally see you on that.
Yeah. And what's funny is when the leader is 2 feet away from the slide and they're using the laser pointer, I'm like, no, maybe use your right arm. Just touch the slide, that's another option.
Right, exactly. I am a huge fan of arm over laser pointer. And the one other challenge, like if you're presenting virtually, is you can't use your arm, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's when I suggest just be overly communicative on what they're seeing on the screen. Look on the left, look on the right, look at the thing that's colored in green or whatever. And that just kind of takes the place of using your arm, per se.
Exactly.
But I also love you. Go ahead, JD. Do you want to?
I got to get to my second one.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Which is an unclear headline. The easiest fix I can make to a leader's slides, especially if I'm brought in like the night before, I don't want to touch a lot of content, but I can look at the headlines and make each of them into short active verbs, like those of us who remember newspapers, a headline in a newspaper would be. And instead of saying financials, say, 2024 financials look amazing, or concerns about 2024 financials. If you just make sure that your headlines are not a word or two or a paragraph, but they're 5 to 9 words with a verb in there and a sense of what that story is, that's the second biggest mistake people make and the easiest correction to make afterwards.
I think it's almost lazy too, right, JD? Because it's like if I just write like agenda or summary or Q3 financials, I don't have to think about what is important on that slide. But that I call it like topic titles versus message titles. Changing to message titles can rock your slide design world, and it's easy to do. It does require a little bit of thinking, but it's so valuable for your audience so they can immediately capture what's important on that slide for sure. One of the things that you talk about is the analogy of the iceberg, which I love this, and you apply it to the approach for slide design. Share with our listeners what you mean by that.
So if we think of the analogy of the iceberg, 90% of it is underwater and only 10% shows up above the water surface. Well, when we think of preparing for a major presentation that's going to have data stories inside of it, that's going to have slides inside of it, the work that you do to get ready for the slides that you do show, that's all below the surface. Mm-hmm. Those are the slides that are in the appendix. Those are the jokes I didn't tell. Those are the elements that just didn't fit in when they said your 10 minutes is now 5 minutes. But the iceberg, that shows up above the surface, that's what the audience sees. That's what they ideally hear, see, and remember, and they take action on. And so that analogy often helps people that they get attached to their slides. And it's like, no, you need to be attached to what the audience is going to get. And cutting slides 5 and 6 doesn't make your presentation weaker. It makes it stronger. And you can always put those in the appendix. You can always share them later. And that seems to help people move to, yeah, it's the piece that I need to share and that I want them to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always the idea of you can have the deck that you present to and the deck that you send as a standalone, pre-read or a
Absolutely.
leave behind. I mean, that seems to be a technique that also works well for lots of the folks I work with. Do you find that also to be the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that again, it's a bit more work up front, but your role as a presenter is to make it easy for the audience to get the information you want them to get. And that extra step is a valuable one to do.
And to that point, telling a story is one of the best ways for your audience to be able to take in your information because it's how we retained information, delivered information, gathered, passed on information for generations since the dawn of time. And there are as many story structures as they are communication coaches like you and me. But what's your favorite? What's the one that you ascribe to?
So I think there are I would agree with you. There are multiple story structures, but I think all of them ultimately come down to the hero's journey.
Hmm.
I love the way Nancy Duarte illustrates this, and I got rights to illustrate it in my book as well. But there's a little bit of context, and then there's an inciting action. There's something that happens, and then there is the rising action to get to the climax. And then after that climax, there's a bit of falling action and a resolution. And those are, if we go back to the late 1800s, those are the 5 parts of a tragedy. Now, we don't want our data stories to be tragic, but if you understand those 5 pieces, I can't skip one of them. They may be shorter. I may give less context. I may, if everybody in the room is familiar with it, I may not have to talk about the journey. I may have to talk about the solution. But I don't want to skip one of those 5 steps. And once I present that model and then have everybody in the audience think of their favorite Star Wars film, their favorite Disney film, their favorite classic story from literature, they all follow that model, and it makes it easy to then see, have I put that model into my data story?
So, as a leader, how do you go about identifying what your story is? Do you have any suggestions for those who might be, just at a loss on how to start?
I always start from the audience and who's going to be in the room. What is it that they need to know about this data?
Mm.
And that can get us in the realm of, well, yeah, it's really just about, I need to have them understand last year. I say, great, why? Well, because that's going to inform choices we make for this year. Great. So now, what is it they need to know, and what's the action I want them to take? Now, what's going to be the best way to share this data to get them to take that action? And once you get in the language of inspiring or inviting the audience to take an action based on the data you've shared, you automatically are in a story format. And it's not a huge leap to say, great, let's put that onto the slide and let's figure out how that can be a story.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the structure that you're offering, the process, and I think just saying, you need to be a storyteller can be terrifying to a lot of leaders because they think, I can't tell a story. I don't know how to do that. But you're breaking it down in such a great way, JD. And I hope that those who are listening realize that it's not, as daunting as they may think that it is. Can you give some quick tips though, relative to story on how to bring that to life in visual form? What do you suggest? Just a couple of tips that we can offer our listeners.
In visual form, you mean on
Slides.
slides?
Yep.
Okay. Um, well, we already talked a bit about animation.
Hmm.
I also think understanding what's the easiest way to illustrate for people to quickly get and remember what you've shared with them.
Mm.
Guy Kawasaki in his books talks about the glance rule, and that the slide comes up, and I've got 7 seconds to understand that slide and understand what it means. If it's investors and I'm an entrepreneur, then it's probably a hockey stick. You know, I was with a
Exactly.
group of entrepreneurs
Right.
last week, and one of them was talking to a VC at a cocktail party, and on his phone had an illustration. I go, oh, there's a green hockey stick. You know,
Right.
everything gets better, and then it gets really good. You know, because we pivot at this point.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, when I'm comparing data that I want people to quickly see the difference in it,
Mm.
a bar chart is much easier for me to quickly understand than a pie chart is.
Yeah.
A pie chart is asking me to compare the arc of the circle and the angle of the pieces of pie. Once you get over 3 or 4 pieces of pie, that's not intuitive, but you show me 10 bars, I can tell you which one's the longest really quickly.
Yeah.
And so it may feel basic to illustrate your data in that way, but you can introduce the concept, you can get the story across, and then you can for days look at and go into the data room and recut and reanalyze. But in the presentation itself, you want to be sure that you make that point quickly. And if they trust the data, which ideally they do, let's have the conversation about the action that we're going to take, not about how we came up with this data.
I love the pie chart versus the bar chart, because honestly, I had not thought about that until I was watching another thing that you put together relative to that. But it is absolutely true. I had a client recently who had 20 different pieces of the pie. I thought, okay, there's no way anybody can figure out what you're trying to say. And she was like, really? That's hard to read. I'm like, yeah, because you live in this, this data like the back of your hand, but think about what it's like to see it for the first time. And I think that oftentimes that is a mistake that I see a lot of leaders make. They are so intimately familiar with it, getting to the curse of knowledge, that they can't imagine what it's like not to have immediate understanding of the visual that they think is amazing, but it's totally confusing for the rest of us mere mortals. But well, we talk about strong leadership presence as connecting the dots, making sure that you can express the broad vision. This can be pretty challenging, though, for those who perhaps began as SMEs, subject matter experts, and then they were elevated to the managerial ranks, the leadership ranks. They have a tendency to want to stay down in the weeds because that's their comfort level. What suggestions do you have when leaders tell the story, supported by the visual aids they've created to accompany it? Like, how do you get them to get out of the weeds and get up to the higher level? You talked about the iceberg, which I think is fantastic. Any other suggestions relative to that?
I work a lot with individual leaders to have a conversation rather than do a speech.
Mm,
Don't do a speech at me, have a conversation with me. And for it really to be a conversation, it's what you and I are experiencing right now. You're talking, I'm listening, I'm processing, I'm responding, I'm talking, you're listening, you're coming up with it. And we're both prepared. We've done our work to be ready for this, but it's a conversation. It's not a speech at your audience. Same thing with a senior leader. They are much better off going through their data at a synthesis level at 5 minutes, and spending 15 minutes fielding questions from people in the audience, really having a conversation with their senior management team, than they are filling the whole time with their voice pushing out the information, but not certain if people agree, understand, are going to take the action that they want them to take.
yeah, don't talk at me, talk with me.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I wanted to come back to a quote that you use. It's from James Buckhouse at Sequoia Capital, and he said, "It's not the message you send or even the message they receive; it's the message they repeat." How should leaders apply this to the way they communicate?
At the early part of presentation development or content development, to keep answering the question, what are the takeaways? What is it I want them to walk away with? And quite often with a senior leader, they're not communicating directly to the front line. They're communicating through 2 or 3 layers. So I want to make my message simple and easy that the branch manager can tell their staff, or the line foreman can tell their team. And that means it's 2 or 3 slides, it's easy to copy, it's easy to forward, easy to share. It doesn't have to be cute, doesn't have to spell an acronym, doesn't have to be Schramm's 7 steps to statistical storytelling, but it has to be clear and memorable. And working on that takeaway, that's where the real value as a leader comes, in being sure that you've delivered the information in a way that people can follow. Because if they can't follow, you're not leading. And when they begin to see that, they are able to shift their approach to presentations.
Right. You want to inspire action. You're not going to inspire action if they are completely confused on what you want them to do.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I always have one final question for my guests, which I'm hoping you're ready for. If not, we'll pause and let you contemplate. But I always like to leave listeners with one big takeaway that they can consider, ruminate on for the next couple of weeks before the next episode comes out. So under the heading of storytelling with statistics, what would be the one big takeaway you'd want them to have?
Storytelling with statistics is not difficult, but it is demanding. So what you ultimately will come up with may have taken you several meetings with your team or several rehearsals with your coach. And when you finally get it, you go, that's all they need. But it's the journey you need to go on to get that data story in a way that's accessible to your team, to your audience, and actionable by them. So it's not difficult, but it is demanding, because you have to keep thinking, what's the question under the question? What's the action I want to see them take? If you get a few wins under your belt where people are like, oh, do you remember when Jill did that talk about the fourth quarter projections and she did that with the apples? Oh my God, I so got, yes, when you have a few wins under your belt, you'll be able to do this just as easily as you do what you did as a subject matter expert that had you rise to the level of leadership. So it's not difficult, but it is demanding.
And you're setting the standard for the entire organization to speak the statistic story in the way that they have, so that it is impactful, and that will seep throughout the entire enterprise. JD, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation, as I knew it would be whenever you said yes, you would come on here. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, it has been my delight, and I look forward to seeing the episodes that follow this one and the conversation that you create with the people who follow you. It's exciting to be a part of, Karin.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with JD as much as I did. And if you'd like to hear more of that conversation, you can, because there is a mini episode that you can have access to by going to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content. Once again, it's speakerdynamics.com/bonus content. And in that mini episode, you'll hear JD talk about a success story, somebody who tells the data story well, and it puts all that theory into a lifelike framework. So check it out if you will. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today. Until next time.